G'day guys, welcome back to another episode. Today, going to be changing out the brake calipers at the front of the Suburban, so let's get into it. So first things first, I'm just going to remove this banjo bolt for the brake line from the back of the caliper. Couple of copper washers, but we've got some new ones of those. I'm going to also be replacing these brake lines because they are, well, they do look original. So now that brake line's off, we're just going to remove two bolts. They're just big Allen key hex. Basically just these two bolts retain the whole caliper on. And once they're off, the whole thing can come out. Now this right front was the side that's got basically a sticking piston. So it's not really doing what it's supposed to be doing, which is just working in general. I've got two remanufactured calipers to go on here. Now I could have probably got some kits to rebuild these, but honestly, these were like $50 Australian. It's just not worth stuffing about with, I don't think, for that price. So yeah, that's one caliper off. So these are pretty well stuffed. So yeah, so this piston is. I'll move that light around so you maybe see a bit better. So this piston here is seized in the caliper. These are a pretty big piston, about a bit over 3 inches diameter. So yeah, if you want big braking power, back then obviously you just whack the bigger piston in. Now I just do 6 pistons, a lot smaller. Benefit is that is you normally do like 3 either side, end up with a longer brake pad, so a lot more friction material. Yeah, so these being remanufactured, there is a core charge for them, but to be honest, it's probably the cost of sending them back to the States. It just won't be financially viable, so I'm just going to hang on to these old calipers. Maybe I'll rebuild them at some point, who knows. New bolts with the new calipers. Yeah, obviously new pads to go with it as well. What's this little tag say? Oh yeah, just junk. Right. I'm not 100% sure on how this clip goes, to be honest, because I've never had one in. I'm pretty sure it's that way. Clip facing down, it feels about right there, so that'll hold it in place as you roll that caliper in. Yeah, I never had that clip on the previous setup, so that slides into place like so, and we re-bolt it in. So these calipers are marked left and right. Pretty much any caliper, always make sure you bleed nipples at the top. Obviously, so when you're bleeding it, all the air will float up to the top, because you don't want air in your brake system, because it just gives you a spongy brake pedal. So obviously after all this we're going to have to bleed it. I'm working by myself, so I'm just going to do a vacuum bleed. I'll show you how all that works, but now that we've got the caliper in place, we'll work on removing this brake line. He's just held in with this one bolt here on the side, and then we'll have to unclip it or unbolt it from the hard brake line on the inside of the chassis rail, and then there's just a little clip that'll, that's why it's spinning there, so great. So my arm is in the way. It's never the easiest trying to film this sort of stuff in a fairly close quarter environment. It'd be so much easier just to throw the camera out of the way sometimes. There you go. So that's that bit out. Now just to get it from the chassis. Yeah, so I don't think I'm going to be able to film this next bit because it's just up inside the chassis rail, but there's the hard line here and it goes into the inside edge of that flexible line. Yeah, I can't even really get the camera up in there. So this is the inside of the new line. This bit goes through the chassis. There's just a little nut that screws on to hold that in place, and then that hard line threads into here. So I'll get that done off camera, and because it'll just be far easier. So I eventually got that brake line in. That was probably a lot more of a nightmare than what I was anticipating. Just trying to get access to the inside the chassis rail was not the easiest. So banjo bolt, 2 washers. It's basically a hollow bolt so the fluid can get through. So one copper washer on the outside, the other obviously on the inside. And we just tighten that up. There we go. The last remaining part is just this retaining bracket. So it's just a single nut. So that's this side done. I'm going to go shoot over and do the other side off camera, but I will grab the camera over and I'll show you how I managed to easy-ish do this this brake line fitting at the chassis, because if you undo it and pull it through, it's a little bit easier to access. So because of the shape of the C channel, it's quite hard to get on that inside and undo everything. So I found if I undo the nut on this thread and pull it through the chassis, I can then get to it reasonably easier, a hell of a lot easier on the outside. These are quite tight, so the crow's foot spanners can come in quite handy, but you need good quality ones. My ones are not really the best. Just cheap stuff, so they don't really, the sizes don't fit very well. Quite often's the case, you end up rounding these brake lines off. I end up using vice grips on these because they get a good grip on the brake line union and don't end up slipping all the time unless they're stupid tight. There we go. I often find you do less damage with the vice grips on these unions than if you try and persist with spanners. They're quite soft material, really. There you go, and that will probably spring back. Oh no, he's going to stay there. And we're going to do the new line while we're here. Now before these get tightened up, doesn't hurt to spin it around to where it needs to be, so it's in that right orientation, that way you're not stressing the rubber line. So now that that's in there, what I often find is because this needs to be orientated a certain way just to get through. The chassis got like a little slot for this to sit in. Just do the final tighten from inside. Alright, so now that we've replaced those front calipers, replaced the front lines, we need to bleed these front brakes. I'm going to do the rears as well, but for the moment we'll just run through the fronts. The rears are pretty much exactly the same procedure. The most important thing is to never let this reservoir get empty while going through the bleeding process. So because I'm bleeding this by myself, I mentioned earlier that I'm going to use a, I'm just going to get the cover off. So, of course that's a different size to the other side, isn't it? Now, where was I? Now, because I'm going to be bleeding this by myself, I don't have anybody, that's tight. I don't have anybody to pump the brakes for me. I'm going to do a vacuum bleed on this. So I use this vacuum pump. So basically you just got one end that slides over the brake bleeder, and we just pump it up to apply the vacuum. Now sometimes you end up sucking a bit of air in through the bleeder thread. I normally just put a bit of grease on those threads, and it just helps seal the air. So I don't know whether you can see, but you can see I pump up a bit of vacuum on there, on the gauge, and it slowly bleeds. So I've got a vacuum in that system, and it'll just suck the fluid through till eventually we get all the air out. That's pretty much as simple as it gets. If you've got somebody else to give you a hand, you can get them to pump the brake pedal while you open and close the bleeder. Probably just a word of caution if you're doing that method. Whoever you've got bleeding, pushing the brake pedal, maybe just try to tell them to maintain the brake travel at about the normal rate of what it would be if you weren't bleeding. Like, don't go all the way to the floor. Especially for an older brake system, you know, your master cylinder could have worn, it could be worn into a certain area, and if you go beyond that you may risk damaging your master cylinder seals. So yeah, just something to think about. And important as well, while I mention while you're doing this, just keep topping up your master cylinder reservoir. Make sure there's fluid in there all the time, don't let it run dry, otherwise you're going to be bleeding through the lines again. So as you can see, while I'm pumping through, putting a bit of vacuum on here, we're starting to pull fluid through. We want to keep going until, obviously while I'm doing it I might as well just do a flush. So I'm going to pull all the old fluid out of the lines, and this will be empty of air by that stage. So I've already drained one of these bottles through it. So I'll probably go, let's have a look at that colour that's coming through. It's looking like it's new, so I think we should be pretty well right. Now ideally I'd have a clear bit of hose, which I might try and see if I've got some, so that way you can see any air bubbles coming through. So that's just maintaining the vacuum on, still just constantly pulling fluid through. Now I've started with the furthest brake caliper away from the master cylinder. That's pretty much what I've always done. It's pretty good practice to, when bleeding and flushing, always go the furthest one away. So yeah, it's running fairly new fluid through, so I'm pretty happy with that. So I'm going to move on and finish bleeding the rest of this brake system. I'll leave this video for now. If you enjoyed this content and you haven't subscribed, then please consider subscribing. We're going to have some Land Rover videos coming up soon again for you guys. I know that's probably the main bulk of what the channel viewers look at. So a front CB boot change out will probably be the next video after this one. So until then, I'll see you next time, guys. Take care.